Hello, my name is Darren Thomas, and I am the Director of Educational Research Techniques. In this video, we're going to be continuing looking at classroom management, and we're going to be focusing on principles of management as they are found in business and trying to see how they apply in the classroom setting. So let's go ahead and see what we can learn. So you can see there's a lot of principles here. There's about 14 of them. And these various principles were developed by a person named Henry Fayol. You can see his picture down in the lower right-hand corner. He was obviously a researcher, studied business and things of that nature back in the 19th century. And he came up with these 14 principles. So some of them that are available are division of work, authority, discipline, unity of command, equity, stability of personnel, etc. Now, Henry Fayol's work is standard information that's studied in like business management as an example. So we are not going to repeat what has already been studied and explained in great detail to the world. Instead, we're going to take these brilliant principles of Fayol and see how they play out in the classroom. And what I mean by classroom, K-12, university, etc., the educational setting. That is what's going to be unique about this particular presentation, if you will. So the first two principles of management that Fayol discusses in his work are divisions of work and authority. So when we're talking about division of work, you have to separate what you want your workers to do into small, manageable pieces. Now, this is a concept that is already used in education, particularly when you're talking about like the psychological aspects of it in the learning, and that is this idea of chunking work into pieces so that students know to complete one small part and then move to a next small part, and then all the pieces come together for a larger picture. That is a commonly found ideal in education as it is, particularly like in curriculum development and when you're studying like educational psychology. Now, the next major bullet here is authority, and that is determining like who is in charge. So again, focusing on the classroom and the educational setting, the primary authority figure in the classroom is the teacher. But what is unique about this, and this is something that Fayol talks about, and you might learn about this in a classroom management course, is that authority is something that is earned. It is very tempting for a teacher to think they're in charge because they're the teacher. Students may not necessarily agree with that, but over time, through demonstrating your expertise and your ability to manage and lead the students, you earn the privilege of being the authority figure. So this is something that also must be kept in mind. Our next two major principles here is going to be discipline and unity of command, So when we're talking about discipline, you can clearly see in this picture over here, we're talking about maintaining order, holding students accountable, making sure everybody knows what to do, etc. So the kids here are lined up, getting ready to have their temperature taken. There's no messing around except for that young man at the back of the line. Now, when we're talking about unity of command, we're talking about the ideal of a single authority. So generally, you want to avoid in the business world having one person report to multiple people. There's a saying that, it's very difficult to, please more than one master. And so this same ideal applies in the classroom naturally. Most of the time, there is one single authority inside a classroom, and that is the teacher. There are, of course, many exceptions. Sometimes there might be volunteers in the classroom, or the teacher might have an assistant, especially like in the kindergarten age group. And so there are situations in the educational setting where this might be blurred. And so in those exceptions, that is where you have to make it clear, like who's the final authority in this particular situation. You want your students to be reporting to one person as much as possible for the sake of clarity. Again, even talking to parents, you have to either do a joint decision in front of the children, or you have to defer the authority to one parent or the other. But what kids do, which is often sneaky, is they'll ask one parent for something that they know the other parent will say no to. And that is a clash of that unity of command. The next two major principles are unity of direction and subordination of individual interests. So what we mean by unity of direction is that there's an overarching goal or shared objectives, if you will, that all the students are trying to achieve in a classroom because we're focusing on education. So often, I mean, probably without exception, all the students are trying to achieve the same objectives. They're often completing the same assignments, etc. There are exceptions, but you want a sense of united direction in guiding a classroom. Now, subordination of individual interests, this is where the students have to set aside what they want, or maybe even the teachers, to achieve these various goals. Now, generally in education, there's been a little bit of a stepping away from this because education is really focused on meeting the needs of individual students. This is a mantra that is very commonly found in education, in that teachers are trying to accommodate the learning styles and the individual differences of students. So in other words, subordinating these individual interests is not as common, although, meeting needs is only up to a certain point. And after that, students often have to try to accommodate the rest of the class, as an example. Now, moving to our next two bullets here as we get closer to the end, we're going to talk about now remuneration and degree of centralization. So remuneration, that's a tricky word to say. That has to do with, the salaries of the workers when we're talking about the business world, the benefits, etc. Generally, students are not given salaries for their work academically. However, remuneration for students is often found in terms of their grades. And of course, if they receive some sort of academic awards for, academic excellence, whatever. And so the point is that, students are not just in the classroom just to learn and enjoy the presence of the teacher, although many people may want that. Students are ultimately there to achieve objectives that are reflected in the grades that they earn, so that they are able to move on to the next step, whether that's the workforce or to continue their studies, whatever it may be. And so it is very, very important that is there, because these grades, obviously, this is the evidence that the student has achieved the various objectives of that particular grade level, that particular assignment, that particular unit, whatever. Now, the next one here is a degree of centralization. And so generally, things are organized from a top-down or a bottom-up approach. And this goes back way to some of the ideals of a subject-centered class versus a student-centered class, whatever, the works of Dewey, perennialism versus essentialism versus progressivism, whatever, in terms of the structure of the class. So old school style teachers often support the ideal of a top-down subject-centered type classroom. Again, that has its strengths and weaknesses, but what's been common much more over the past 40, 50 years now has been more of a democratic style of, the teacher is a guide on the side, collaborative learning, students leading out. That's been more popular over, the past 40 or 50 years or so, I would believe. And so again, without trying to criticize one side or the other, you need to be aware that there are strengths and weaknesses of both in terms of teaching, and that these are related to Fayol's ideal of centralization. Where is the actual final authority centered at within a classroom? Now, our next two are scalar chain and, of course, order. So scalar chain has to do with the chain of command. Again, this is something that's probably not as relevant to the traditional or regular classroom, but in the business setting, you go to the supervisor, and then after that, you might go to the manager, and after that, maybe to the director. That's how it kind of works, like in a state government type setting. But for students, normally there's just go straight to the teacher. Now, sometimes, and I've done this as a teacher myself, you might decentralize the scalar chain of command. So you might put students in groups. You make a group leader, and then students in that group need to go to the group leader first, and then the group leader might come to you, as an example. So that's one way where you can set up a scalar chain of command. And one of the reasons that this may be beneficial is that you don't have to deal with small stuff. If it's something small, you want the students or the local student manager, if you will, to deal with it. Whereas you as a teacher, you deal with problems that are too complex for the students to handle, as an example. So if a student needs a pencil, maybe it's possible to set up in your classroom a way in which they are able to go to another student to achieve that, as an example. And that leads into our next major bullet here, and that is order. Now, for Fayol, order has to do with making sure that the workers have the tools they need to complete a job, as an example. And so this applies to the teachers as well. you got to make sure students have pencil, paper, that they have their books, their backpacks. You got to make sure they eat sometimes. There's many different things that are related to order. And so if the students do not have these things, it's going to be very difficult to manage them throughout the day. And again, we could give more examples, like when Maslow talks about hierarchy of needs and how you have to meet the lower needs first. It's hard to study when you're having problems at home, as an example. So there's lots of ways to build off of this. And so you can see in the picture over here, a couple years ago, it was very common for people to make a run on stores to secure, toilet paper. All right, getting closer to the end here. Now, we're talking about two more, and that is equity and stability of personnel. So when we talk about equity, we're talking about making sure things are fair, that the students are all treated the same, that there's no favoritism. These are things that you want to avoid, because what happens is that when students develop a perception that things are not fair, that the rules are not being applied the same, they often will have less respect for whatever rules are there. So there might be a rule where a teacher favors girls over boys. All right, that rule is bad. But see, that same teacher might have other rules that are appropriate. Now, here's the thing. Because there's favoritism based on gender, students might reject all rules that come from that teacher because that teacher has one rule that is perceived as unfair. So it is very important that as a teacher, when you are trying to set up your rules and policies, that they are applied the same to all students all the time. I mean, the rule might be unreasonable as an example, but if it's applied evenly among all students, it can be tolerated. But when one group is getting something, another group is not, that is when there's often problems. The next bullet here is stability of personnel. And this has to do with, as a principal, you don't want to have teachers quitting all the time, over the years or even within a semester or a month or whatever. That is instability of personnel. And as a teacher, you don't want students changing classes every month, every week, or within the semester. That is instability. It makes it hard to achieve learning objectives when you don't have the students there long enough to achieve them. This is why it's unusual generally for students to move during the school year, because of that chaos that it entails in terms of taking a child out of one school and putting him in another. Now, of course, it does happen, but often parents will try to avoid that because they know of the instability and chaos that brings. The same thing with the school. They're not going to move kids from class to class within a semester because of that instability. And they're definitely probably not going to move teachers from class to class. Unless, of course, something highly unusual happens, which does take place at times. Now, getting to our last two bullets here, I believe, we are dealing with initiative and spirit de corps. So when we're talking about initiative, we're talking about the students feeling comfortable to share their opinion, to make suggestions, etc. Again, this is adjusting ideals taken from Fayol. And so again, you want to establish an environment in which students feel comfortable sharing their concerns or sharing ideas on how things can be done, etc. Because this will, as we look at the next bullet, it'll help to boost morale. When students are convinced they have a voice, they are often much more engaged in whatever the outcomes of the process is that they make suggestions to. And finally, to look at our last bullet, spirit de corps, we're talking about the overall classroom environment. So how pleasant it is to be in the classroom. Is the teacher sharing things in a clear manner? Are they consistent in how they do things? Is there a sense of fairness? All right. Are you able to share things freely? And so again, when these things are happening, when the classroom environment is pleasant, and of course that's subjective, but when the students perceive that the classroom is a pleasant place to be, it's a positive environment in which to learn, this will often help with managing the behavior. So I'm not going to repeat all of these bullets again as a summary because that'll just make the video even longer. They're here on your screen. And so remember that these ideas here that we're talking about came from Henry Fayol, and primarily in this video, we try to apply these principles of management to a traditional classroom, whether it's K-12 or university. So my name is Darren Thomas. I am the Director of Educational Research Techniques. Thank you so much for watching and take care.